My name is Alexandria, and at 65 years old, I never thought I would be hiding in the back seat of my son Daniel's car, like some teenager playing a prank. We had always been close, especially after my husband died, but lately something had felt off between us. That Tuesday afternoon in September, I thought surprising him would bring back our old playfulness. Instead, I overheard a conversation between him and his fiancée that shattered everything I believed about our relationship. What I discovered in that car changed us forever. If you have ever felt the sting of betrayal from someone you trusted completely, let me know where you are watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you will want to hear how this story ends. I have lived in the same two-story colonial house in Portland for 30 years now. It has the perfect kitchen with bay windows overlooking my garden where I still grow tomatoes and zucchini every summer. The walls are filled with family photos, most featuring Daniel at various stages of his life. My husband Robert and I bought this house when Daniel was just 5, planning to fill it with more children, but life had other plans. Robert used to joke that we got quality over quantity with our son. 8 years ago, Robert collapsed while mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. A sudden heart attack took him instantly, the doctors said. One minute I was making sandwiches in the kitchen, the next I was a widow at 57. The grief was all-consuming, like drowning on dry land. During those dark months, it was Daniel who became my anchor. He was 27 then, already establishing himself in his career, but he drove the 2 hours from Seattle every weekend for nearly 6 months. Daniel has always been driven and focused. He graduated from University of Washington with honors and quickly climbed the ranks at Westfield Financial Services, becoming one of their top financial advisors by 30. His clients adore him for his meticulous attention to detail and genuine concern for their financial well-being. He inherited his father's analytical mind and my empathetic nature, a powerful combination in his field. 2 years ago, Daniel met Stephanie at a charity fundraiser in Seattle. She works as a marketing executive for a tech company, always impeccably dressed with perfect makeup and not a strand of her sleek brown hair out of place. From the beginning, there was something about her that made me uneasy, though I tried to dismiss it as standard mother-in-law wariness. She is undeniably intelligent and ambitious, with a confidence that borders on intimidating. After Robert died, Daniel and I established a tradition of Sunday dinners. He would drive down from Seattle, arriving around 4 in the afternoon. I would spend the morning preparing his favorites, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, my special mac and cheese with 4 cheeses, and breadcrumb topping or chicken parmesan with homemade sauce from garden tomatoes. For dessert, I always made apple pie or chocolate layer cake, the recipes passed down from my mother. These Sundays became sacred to me, a ritual that gave structure to my week and comfort to my heart. We would sit at the dining table Robert had crafted by hand, sharing stories about our week. Daniel would tell me about complicated financial strategies he was developing for clients, and I would share anecdotes about my former students who still kept in touch, or the latest drama from my book club. When Stephanie entered the picture, our Sunday tradition gradually expanded to include her. At first, she would join every other week, then it became regular. I genuinely tried to welcome her, adapting my cooking to accommodate her gluten sensitivity and preference for white meat. I asked about her work, her family in California, her hobbies. I showed interest in their wedding plans, offering suggestions only when asked. I wanted so badly for her to like me, to feel part of our small family. Over the past few months, however, I started noticing subtle changes in Daniel. Our Sunday dinners became less frequent, with last-minute texts about client emergencies or Stephanie not feeling well. Our phone conversations grew shorter, his tone distracted. When I brought up wedding plans, he would quickly change the subject. He shared fewer details about his work and personal life, creating a distance I could feel but couldn't name. I worried privately about certain behaviors I observed in Stephanie. She constantly checked Daniel's phone when it chimed with notifications. She often answered questions directed at him, as if appointed to speak on his behalf. When I shared family stories, particularly about Daniel's childhood, she would smile politely, but her eyes would glaze over with disinterest. Once, when Daniel mentioned possibly buying a vacation cabin near my home to visit more often, she immediately listed all the practical reasons it was a poor investment. These concerns festered in my mind, but I kept them to myself. Daniel seemed happy, and wasn't that what mattered most? Perhaps I was being oversensitive or reading too much into normal relationship dynamics. Perhaps this was simply the natural evolution of a mother-son relationship, as he prepared to start his own family. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting between us, and not for the better. That Tuesday in September started like any ordinary day. I had gone to Westfield Shopping Center to buy new kitchen towels and perhaps browse the bookstore for my book club's next selection. The sky was that perfect Portland blue that appears in early fall, with just enough crispness in the air to hint at the coming season. I had just exited the department store, arms loaded with shopping bags, when I spotted a familiar car in the parking lot. Daniel's distinctive blue Audi was parked about 50 yards away, unmistakable, with the small dent on the rear bumper from when he had backed into a fire hydrant last Christmas. I stopped in my tracks, surprised to see his car in Portland on a Tuesday afternoon. He hadn't mentioned any plans to come down from Seattle. A flood of memories washed over me. As I stood there, memories of the playful relationship we had always shared. When Daniel was young, he would hide behind doors to jump out and scare me, dissolving into fits of giggles at my exaggerated reactions. For his birthdays, I created elaborate treasure hunts throughout our house and yard, with clues leading to his presence. Even as a teenager, when many boys his age were pulling away from their mothers, Daniel maintained that playful connection with me. After Robert died, those light-hearted moments became less frequent, weighed down by grief and new responsibilities. But occasionally, Daniel would still try to make me laugh with a silly joke or by sneaking up behind me while I cooked. Those moments were precious lifelines back to joy during the darkest period of my life. Standing there in the parking lot, I was suddenly struck by an impulsive idea. What if I surprised him? I could hide in his back seat and jump out when he returned to his car, just like we used to do to each other. Maybe it would break through whatever tension had been building between us lately. Maybe it would remind him of the close, loving relationship we had always had. I approached his car cautiously, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. It felt slightly ridiculous, a woman my age planning to hide in someone's car, but the thought of Daniel's surprised face made me smile. I tried the back door and found it unlocked, which seemed unusual for my cautious son, but I didn't question my good fortune. Climbing into the back seat was more difficult than I had anticipated. My knees aren't what they used to be, and maneuvering my body into a hiding position required some undignified contortions. Finally, I settled behind the driver's seat, where Daniel wouldn't immediately see me when he got in. I found his gym jacket on the floor and arranged it partially over me to better conceal my presence. I checked my watch, 2:30 in the afternoon. I had no idea how long I might be waiting, but surely he wouldn't be shopping for hours. I settled in as comfortably as possible, already imagining his reaction. Would he yell in surprise, laugh, pretend to be angry before breaking into a smile? The anticipation made my heart light in a way it hadn't been for months. As I waited, the initial excitement began to fade into physical discomfort. The floor was hard against my aging knees, and my back started to protest the awkward position. 20 minutes passed, then 25. I shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position without compromising my hiding place. A small voice in my head began questioning the wisdom of this spontaneous plan. What if he had a business meeting? What if he wasn't alone? What if he had taken an Uber here and this car would sit in the parking lot all day? Despite these emerging doubts, I decided to follow through. I had come this far, and the potential joy of reconnecting with my son through our old playfulness outweighed the temporary discomfort. Still, something felt off. A strange tension had settled in my stomach, an intuition I couldn't quite identify. After nearly 30 minutes of waiting, I heard voices approaching. My heart quickened with anticipation, and I pulled the jacket more securely over my legs. This was it. I prepared myself to jump up and surprise my son, hoping to create one of those memorable moments we would laugh about for years to come. The voices grew clearer as they approached the car. I recognized Daniel's, immediately followed by the precise, measured tones of Stephanie. They were discussing ordinary things, shopping purchases, and whether they should stop for coffee before heading back. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Once they were settled in the car, I would count to 10, and then make my surprise appearance. I heard the electronic beep of the car unlocking, then the driver's door opened. Daniel slid into the seat directly in front of me, while Stephanie took the passenger side. The car dipped slightly with their weight, and the doors closed with dual thuds. The scent of Daniel's cologne mixed with Stephanie's perfume filled the small space. Did you get everything you needed? Daniel asked, starting the engine. The air conditioning hummed to life. Yes, finally. The wedding planner has been hounding me about finalizing these vendor contacts, Stephanie replied. I could hear papers rustling in her bag. Speaking of the wedding, we need to talk about your mother. I froze, my curiosity instantly piqued. They had no idea I was there, just inches away, listening to every word. What about her? Daniel's voice held a note of wariness. Your mother keeps pushing her outdated ideas about the wedding, Stephanie said, her tone shifting from conversational to irritated. She called me again yesterday with suggestions for the centerpieces, even though I've told her multiple times that we're going with a minimalist theme. Mom's just trying to be helpful, Daniel said, but his defense sounded weak even to my ears. She calls me every other day with suggestions I don't want, Stephanie continued. The way she inserts herself into everything is overwhelming, Daniel. It's our wedding, not hers. My chest tightened. I had only called Stephanie twice in the past month and had mentioned centerpieces just once when she had asked for my opinion. Was this how she perceived my involvement? Daniel sighed heavily. Mom's always been too involved in my life. It got worse after Dad died. His words struck me like a physical blow. Too involved, I had thought we were close, supportive, loving. She's been especially clingy since Dad died, he continued, unaware of the pain each word was causing me. I understand she was lonely, but it's like I'm her whole world now, and it's becoming too much to handle. Tears sprang to my eyes, but I remained frozen in silence. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be how my son really felt about me. Stephanie seemed emboldened by Daniel's agreement. I think we need to set some boundaries before the wedding. I'm thinking we should limit her involvement in the planning process from now on. Tell her the planner wants to take over completely or something. That might be best, Daniel agreed. And after we're married, I think we should cut those Sunday dinners to once a month at most. It's ridiculous that we drive all the way down here every weekend just because she expects it. You're right, it does eat up our whole day. Each word from my son's mouth felt like a betrayal, dismantling years of what I thought was mutual love and enjoyment of our time together. Her attachment to you is unhealthy, Stephanie said, her voice softening into something that sounded like concern but felt manipulative to my ears. The way she calls you every day, the way she manipulates you with stories about how lonely she is. It's not normal. I wanted to speak up to defend myself. I didn't call every day, only 2 or 3 times a week. I rarely mentioned being lonely specifically to avoid making Daniel feel responsible for my happiness. Was checking in with my only child really so abnormal? There's something else we need to discuss, Stephanie said, changing tactics. I got the official offer from BrightPath Technologies yesterday. In Chicago, Daniel asked. Yes, it's an amazing opportunity, Daniel, Director of Marketing for their entire Midwest division. They need an answer by next Friday. Chicago. My mind reeled with this new information. Daniel had never mentioned anything about Chicago. Have you decided what you'll tell them? He asked. I want to take it. The question is, are you coming with me? There was a pause during which I held my breath. Of course I am, Daniel finally said. We're getting married. Where you go, I go. What about your mother? Stephanie pressed. Another pause, longer this time. I haven't told her yet. Don't you think you should have? We've known this was a possibility for weeks. She'll make it about herself and how I'm abandoning her, Daniel said, frustration evident in his voice. She'll try to guilt me into staying. You know how she is. So what's your plan? Drop it on her after the wedding. By the way, Mom, we're moving 2,000 miles away next week. Maybe we should wait until after the wedding to tell her, Daniel suggested. She's so excited about it, and this would just overshadow everything. Your mother will make this difficult no matter when you tell her, Stephanie said dismissively. But fine, if you want to put it off, that's your choice. Just don't expect me to pretend I'm excited about living in Seattle when we see her at dinner on Sunday. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain they must hear it. Silent tears streamed down my face as I struggled to process everything I was hearing. My son, my only child, was planning to move across the country and hadn't even considered telling me. Worse, he was discussing me as if I were a problem, to be managed, an obligation to be tolerated, rather than a person with feelings, rather than his mother who loved him more than anything in this world. The physical pain in my chest was intense, as if my heart were literally breaking. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to escape. My body shook with the effort of remaining silent, while my world collapsed around me. How had I misunderstood our relationship so profoundly? Had I been deluding myself all these years about the closeness we shared? As Daniel pulled out of the parking space, I shifted slightly to accommodate the movement of the car. My leg had fallen asleep, and as I tried to adjust, my foot accidentally kicked the back of his seat. The sound seemed deafening in the confined space. An immediate silence fell over the car. I could see Daniel's knuckles whiten on the steering wheel. "What was that?" Stephanie asked, alarm evident in her voice. Daniel pulled the car abruptly back into a parking space and twisted around in his seat. His eyes widened in shock as they met mine. "Mom." His voice was a mixture of confusion and horror. "What are you doing in my car?" I struggled to sit up properly, the gym jacket falling away from my tear-stained face. "I saw your car in the parking lot," I said, my voice trembling. "I thought I would surprise you like we used to do to each other." Stephanie had turned around now, too, her face flushed with anger. "You were spying on us. You were hiding in the car, listening to our private conversation." Her voice rose with each question. "I wasn't spying," I protested weakly. "I was going to surprise Daniel. I had no idea you would be talking about me." Daniel's face had drained of color. "How much did you hear?" "Everything," I said, fresh tears welling in my eyes. "I heard everything, Daniel. How I'm clingy and too involved in your life. How my attachment to you is unhealthy. How you're moving to Chicago and couldn't even bother to tell me." "Mom, you're taking everything out of context," Daniel stammered, unable to meet my eyes directly. "We were just talking. It wasn't serious." "It sounded very serious to me," I said. "How long have you been planning to cut me out of your life?" "No one is cutting you out," he protested. "Limiting my role in your wedding, reducing our Sunday dinners to once a month, moving 2,000 miles away without telling me what would you call it." "This is exactly why we can't be honest with you," Daniel's voice rose in frustration. "You overreact to everything. You make everything about yourself." His words cut deep, echoing what he had said to Stephanie just minutes earlier. "I've devoted everything to you," I said, my voice breaking. "After your father died, you were my whole world, and this is how you repay that love." "That's the problem right there," Stephanie interjected coldly. "A mother shouldn't make her adult son her whole world. It's unhealthy. This situation proves exactly what I was saying about boundaries. What kind of person hides in someone's car anyway?" I turned to her, anger temporarily overriding my hurt. "I have never tried to control Daniel's life. I've supported every decision he's made, including his decision to marry you, even when I had reservations." "Reservations?" Stephanie's eyes narrowed. "So you've been pretending to like me all this time?" "I've been trying to like you," I corrected. "For Daniel's sake. But it's clear you've been working to drive a wedge between us from the beginning." "Mom, that's not fair," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Take me home," I said firmly. "I can't do this here. Just take me home." The drive to my house was excruciating. I sat in the back seat, tears flowing silently down my face. In the front, Stephanie whispered urgently to Daniel, too low for me to hear the words, but the angry tone was unmistakable. Daniel's shoulders were hunched, his body radiating distress and conflict. When we finally pulled up in front of my house, I gathered my dignity as best I could and opened the car door. "I never thought my own son would break my heart like this," I said quietly. "Don't worry about Sunday dinner anymore. You're both free of that burden." "Mom, wait," Daniel called as I got out, but he made no move to follow me. He remained in the car with Stephanie watching as I walked up the path to my empty house. Once inside, with the door firmly closed behind me, I finally allowed myself to collapse. The sobs came from deep within my body, painful and raw. The house that had always been my sanctuary now felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. Photos of Daniel smiled at me from the walls, now seeming like images of a stranger rather than the son I thought I knew. The days that followed passed in a fog of grief. I didn't answer Daniel's calls or texts, of which there were many. The first few were defensive, explaining that I had misunderstood the conversation that he and Stephanie had been stressed about wedding planning. Later ones became apologetic, asking to talk in person. I couldn't bring myself to respond to any of them. I moved through my daily routines mechanically. The garden went untended, tomatoes rotting on the vine. I made coffee but let it grow cold. I sat in Robert's old armchair for hours staring out the window, replaying the conversation in the car over and over. Had I truly been as clingy as they described? Had my love for my son become a burden to him? At night, sleep eluded me. I would lie awake until the early hours, then drift into restless dreams from which I woke exhausted. I lost interest in cooking, surviving on toast and cereal. The kitchen, usually my favorite room in the house, felt empty without the prospect of Sunday dinners to plan for. Several times I found myself standing in Daniel's old bedroom now, a guest room but still containing boxes of his childhood possessions. I paged through photo albums tracing his growth, from a round-faced toddler to a gap-toothed elementary student to a handsome young man in his graduation cap and gown. In every photo, my love for him was evident in my expression. Had that love become suffocating without my realizing it? The physical manifestations of my emotional pain were impossible to ignore. I had no appetite, forcing myself to eat small portions just to maintain my strength. A constant fatigue weighed down my limbs. My eyes were perpetually swollen from crying, and headaches became a daily occurrence. Daniel's attempts to reach me grew more frequent and urgent. My phone displayed his calls multiple times each day, all sent to voicemail. Texts accumulated unread. "Mom, please call me back. We need to talk about this. I'm worried about you. Please don't shut me out." On the Saturday after the incident, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Daniel standing on the porch alone. I stood silently on the other side of the door, not moving, barely breathing, until eventually he left a small package and walked away. Later, I found it contained a box of my favorite chocolates, and a card saying simply, "I'm sorry, please talk to me." I put both in a drawer, unable to deal with either. As the initial shock began to fade, I found myself questioning everything about my role as a mother. Had I been too involved in Daniel's life? After Robert died, had I leaned too heavily on my son for emotional support? Had I unconsciously manipulated him with my loneliness? Was I unable to see him as an independent adult with his own life to lead? These painful questions circled in my mind without resolution. After a week of isolation, I finally reached out to my longtime friend Laura. We had taught at the same elementary school for 20 years before retirement, and she had known Daniel since he was a baby. If anyone could give me an honest perspective, it would be Laura. We met at a coffee shop 15 miles from my home, far from any place Daniel might be. I chose a table in the corner and waited, feeling strangely exposed in public after days of seclusion. Laura arrived with a warm hug that nearly broke my composure again. "Alexandria, you look terrible," she said, frankly squeezing my hand. "What's happened?" The whole story poured out of me, every painful detail of what I had overheard, and the confrontation that followed. Laura listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to sympathy to thoughtfulness. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I'm so sorry you had to hear those things," she finally said. "That must have been devastating." "Was I really so blind?" I asked. "Have I been suffocating him all this time?" Laura considered her words carefully. "You've centered your life around Daniel since Robert died," she said gently. "Your week revolves around Sunday dinner. You talk about him constantly. Your house is a shrine to his achievements." I started to protest, but she continued, "This doesn't excuse what they said or how they said it. That was cruel, and they should have talked to you directly about their concerns. But perhaps Stephanie felt threatened by your close relationship." "I've never tried to come between them," I said defensively. "Not intentionally, no. But think about it from her perspective. Her fiancé drives 2 hours every week to have dinner with his mother. He calls you multiple times a week. You're involved in their wedding planning. That's a lot of you in their relationship." I felt a flash of irritation at Laura's words, but beneath it was a reluctant recognition of potential truth. "When Robert died," Laura continued, "Daniel stepped up beautifully. He supported you through your grief, and that created a different kind of bond between you. But maybe it's time to rebalance that relationship now that he's starting his own family." "So you agree with them?" "I'm clingy and manipulative." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. "That's not what I said," Laura corrected firmly. "There's nothing wrong with loving your son deeply. But there might be some truth to the idea that you've wrapped too much of your identity around being Daniel's mother at the expense of other parts of yourself." I stared into my cooling coffee, letting her words sink in. "Let me ask you something," Laura said. "What did you do last week before this happened? Not related to Daniel, just for yourself." I struggled to answer. I had gone shopping, but partly to look for napkins for Sunday dinner. I had read a book for book club, but our meeting had been canceled. I had called a former student who had just had a baby, but the conversation had mostly been about my memories of Daniel at that age. "My point exactly," Laura said, watching the realization dawn on my face. "After Robert died, you needed Daniel to help you survive the grief. That was natural and necessary. But 8 years later, your life is still revolving around him. When was the last time you painted you used to love watercolors? When did you stop going to the theater group or volunteering at the library?" Laura had experienced her own challenges with adult children. Her daughter had moved to Australia 5 years ago, and they now saw each other only once every couple of years. She had navigated the pain of that physical distance while maintaining a close emotional connection. "The hardest question," Laura said, reaching across the table to hold my hand, "is who are you, if not primarily Daniel's mother?" I had no answer. The question opened a void within me that was terrifying to contemplate. As I drove home, Laura's words echoed in my mind. Perhaps there was some truth in what Daniel and Stephanie had said, though their delivery had been hurtful beyond measure. Perhaps I had been holding too tightly, afraid of losing the last piece of the family Robert and I had created together. My house looked different when I returned, as if seeing it through new eyes. The multitude of photos, the preserved childhood art projects the calendar marked prominently with Sunday dinner every week. Had my home become a museum to motherhood rather than a space for my current life? I was still deeply hurt by what had happened, but something had shifted. A tiny crack had opened in my pain, allowing in the first glimmer of clarity. I was 65 years old. I might have another 20 or 30 years of life ahead of me. Who did I want to be for those years? And was there a way to love my son deeply without making him the center of my existence? The next morning I woke with purpose for the first time since the incident. After breakfast, I climbed the stairs to the spare room where I stored things rarely used but too precious to discard. In the back of the closet behind winter coats and old suitcases, I found what I was looking for: my painting supplies. The wooden case contained watercolor paints, many dried up from years of neglect, alongside brushes stiff with old paint. I brought it downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table, a tangible symbol of something I had once loved for myself alone. While searching for the paint supplies, I had also found my old datebook from before Robert died. Flipping through it was a revelation. Nearly every day had contained some activity: watercolor classes on Tuesdays, volunteer shifts at the library, on Thursdays theater group rehearsals, on Wednesday evenings, hiking with colleagues on Saturday mornings. So many engagements, all crossed out after Robert's death and never reinstated. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life once full of personal interests and connections beyond family, I made a decision. If Daniel and Stephanie's words had contained any truth, if I had indeed been clinging too tightly to my role as mother, then the solution wasn't just to wait for reconciliation. The solution was to reclaim the parts of myself I had set aside. That afternoon, I called the community center and enrolled in a watercolor class for seniors that met on Tuesday mornings. I contacted the local animal shelter and offered to volunteer on Sunday afternoons, deliberately choosing the time that had been reserved for family dinners. I found information about a book club that met at the library, different from my previous one, but welcoming new members. The following Tuesday, I attended my first painting class with nervous anticipation. The room was filled with men and women around my age, some clearly experienced painters, others complete beginners. The instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Janet, welcomed me warmly and helped me set up my supplies tactfully, suggesting which of my ancient paints could still be used and which should be replaced. "We're doing landscapes today," she explained, displaying her own example at the front of the room. "Nothing too complex, just focus on capturing the light on the mountains." I hadn't held a paintbrush with artistic intent for nearly a decade, and my first attempts were clumsy and hesitant. The paper buckled from too much watercolors, bled into each other unintentionally, and my mountains looked more like lumpy hills. But as the 2-hour class progressed, something unexpected happened. I became completely absorbed in the process, the world narrowing to the movement of brush on paper, the behavior of pigment in water, the challenge of translating what I saw in my mind to the blank page before me. For those 2 hours, I didn't think about Daniel or Stephanie or the painful words in the car. I didn't think about my identity as a mother or a widow. I just painted, and it felt like returning to a part of myself long forgotten. After class, 3 women invited me to join them for coffee at the cafe next door. Grace, Barbara, and Helen had been taking classes together for years and had formed a tight friendship. To my surprise, they welcomed me into their circle, without hesitation, asking about my background in painting and sharing stories of their own artistic journeys. Over the following weeks, these Tuesday coffee gatherings became a highlight of my new routine. We would discuss our paintings, certainly, but also books. We were reading movies we had seen, and eventually our families. When I finally felt comfortable enough to share a simplified version of my situation with Daniel, I was met with understanding rather than judgment. Grace in particular nodded with recognition. "My son and I went through something similar about 10 years ago," she said. "Different circumstances, but the same basic issue. He felt I was too involved in his life, and I felt he was ungrateful for my involvement." "How did you resolve it?" I asked, hungry for guidance. "Painfully," she admitted with a small smile. "We didn't speak for 3 months, but during that time I did exactly what you're doing. I built a life that wasn't centered around him. And when we finally did talk again, our relationship was different. Better actually, because it was based on mutual respect rather than dependence. I began to look forward to my painting classes with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt for anything in years. Each week I could see small improvements in my technique. Janet was a patient teacher offering suggestions without criticism. "Art is about expression, not perfection," she often reminded us. At home, I cleared out a corner of the dining room to set up a small painting area. The walls of my house, once dominated by family photos, gradually incorporated my own artwork. Most pieces weren't gallery-worthy, but they represented something important, my identity beyond family roles. My volunteer shifts at the animal shelter brought different kinds of joy. I would spend Sunday afternoons walking dogs that rarely got attention or simply sitting with elderly cats, providing the human contact they craved. There was something healing in caring for creatures who asked nothing of me except my presence in that moment. One Sunday after finishing my shift, I realized I had laughed more that afternoon than in the entire previous year. The recognition startled me. When had joy become so rare in my life? Had I been so focused on preserving my relationship with Daniel, exactly as it had been, that I had lost the capacity for spontaneous happiness? I reconnected with my former teaching colleague Susan, who had been inviting me on hiking trips for years, invitations I had consistently declined in favor of preparing for Sunday dinners. Now we met every Friday morning at a different trail, gradually increasing the difficulty as my stamina improved. The physical exertion cleared my mind in ways nothing else could, and the natural beauty of Oregon's forests and mountains restored something essential in my spirit. As weeks passed, I noticed physical changes alongside the emotional ones. The constant fatigue lifted. My appetite returned, especially after hiking. I slept better, no longer lying awake, replaying painful conversations. The headaches receded. Even my posture improved, as if I were literally standing taller in my reclaimed life. My home began to reflect these changes too. I didn't remove family photos, but I rearranged them, creating space for other aspects of my life to be represented. I cleared out some of Daniel's childhood memorabilia from the spare room, packing most into boxes for him to decide about later, keeping only a few treasured items on display. The calendar on my refrigerator, once dominated by a single weekly event, now contained multiple engagements: painting class coffee with new friends, hiking with Susan, volunteer shifts at the shelter book club meetings. Looking at it gave me a sense of satisfaction and possibility I hadn't experienced in years. 3 weeks after the incident in the car, as I was returning from a particularly enjoyable book club discussion, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I had seen his calls come in regularly over the weeks, but had never felt ready to answer. This time something had changed. The sight of his name no longer sent me into an emotional tailspin. I felt steady enough, centered enough in my newly expanding life to hear what he had to say. I answered the call. "Hello, Daniel." There was a moment of startled silence, as if he hadn't expected me to pick up. "Mom," he said finally, his voice subdued. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I'm ready to talk now," I said simply. Another pause. "Can we meet somewhere? I miss you, please." I considered the request. A month ago, I would have dropped everything to accommodate him immediately. Now I consulted my mental calendar. I could meet tomorrow afternoon around 2. There's a coffee shop on Linden Street called Morningside. "I'll be there," he said quickly before I could change my mind. "Thank you, Mom." After we disconnected, I sat in my car for several minutes, processing the complex emotions the brief conversation had stirred. There was still hurt, certainly. The words I had overheard couldn't be unheard. But there was also a new sense of strength, a confidence, that whatever happened next, I would be okay. My happiness no longer depended entirely on my relationship with my son. It was a bittersweet realization. As I prepared to meet Daniel the next day, I chose my outfit carefully, a blue dress I had recently purchased during a shopping trip with Grace and Helen. I applied makeup with care and styled my hair. These small acts of self-presentation were not about impressing Daniel, but about reminding myself of the person I was becoming separate from my role as his mother. I drove to the coffee shop with a nervous anticipation in my stomach. Part of me feared what Daniel might say, but another part, growing stronger each day, was curious about what this new chapter in our relationship might look like. For the first time in weeks, I felt ready to find out. I arrived at Morningside Coffee, 15 minutes early, and chose a table near the back where we would have some privacy for our conversation. The cafe was cozy and warm, with soft jazz playing in the background, and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans in the air. I ordered a chamomile tea to calm my nerves and watched the door. Daniel arrived right on time, scanning the room anxiously until he spotted me. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes, and a certain tenseness in his shoulders that I recognized from his childhood days of stress over exams. He had come alone, for which I was grateful. This conversation needed to be between just the two of us. "Mom," he said, approaching the table with hesitance. He seemed unsure whether to hug me or not, finally settling for an awkward touch on my shoulder before sitting down across from me. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." "I needed time," I replied simply. A server approached, and Daniel ordered black coffee, his hands fidgeting with the menu as he did so. When we were alone again, he looked directly at me for the first time. "What you heard in the car that day was inexcusable." He began, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had rehearsed them many times. "I said things that were hurtful and unfair. I was frustrated and stressed about the wedding and the job situation, and I took it out on you in a conversation I never thought you would hear. But that's no excuse." I nodded, acknowledging his words, but not yet ready to absolve him. "The truth is," he continued, "I've been a coward. I've been letting Stephanie dictate terms instead of standing up for what I know is right. I've taken your love and support for granted because it was always there, unconditional and reliable." "You broke my heart that day, Daniel," I said quietly. "Not just because of what you said, but because I realized I had completely misunderstood our relationship. I thought we had something special, something mutual, but it seems I've just been a burden to you." "No, Mom, that's not true," he protested, reaching across the table toward my hand but stopping short of touching it. "You have never been a burden. What happened was, I let someone else's perspective color my own. Stephanie has a complicated relationship with her own mother, and she projected a lot of that onto our relationship." "But you agreed with her," I pointed out. "You said I was clingy, that I made everything about myself." Daniel winced at the reminder. "I did say those things, and they were wrong and cruel. But Mom, there was something true underneath that I didn't know how to express properly. After Dad died, our relationship changed. You needed me, and I stepped up because I love you. But somewhere along the line, the balance shifted too far. I started feeling responsible for your happiness in a way that became overwhelming sometimes." His words stung, but I could recognize the honesty in them now. The past weeks of self-reflection had prepared me to hear hard truths without being destroyed by them. "The thing is," I said carefully, "there was truth in what I overheard, even if the way you expressed it was hurtful. But it forced me to see how I've defined myself only as your mother, especially since your father died. I let go of everything else that made me who I am." I told him about the painting classes, the hiking trips, the new friends, the volunteer work. His expression shifted from concern to genuine pleasure as I described my new activities. "That sounds amazing, Mom. I haven't seen you this animated in years." "I'm learning who I am beyond being your mother," I explained. "And that's something I needed to do regardless of what happened between us. We both need to redefine our relationship as adults, with separate lives that intersect rather than merge." Daniel nodded relief, evident in his expression. "I've made some changes too," he said. "After what happened, I did a lot of thinking about my life and my choices." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I postponed the wedding. This genuinely surprised me. You and Stephanie aren't getting married." "I didn't say that. We're still engaged, but we've pushed the date back 6 months. We need to work through some things first." I realized I've been avoiding conflict with her the same way I avoided it with you, by agreeing and then resenting it later. That's not fair to anyone. "And Chicago?" I asked cautiously. "I declined the job transfer," he said. "Not because of you," he added quickly, "but because I realized I was making that decision for the wrong reasons too. I love my team in Seattle. I've built a client base there, and honestly, I don't want to live in Chicago. I've never liked big cities." He stirred his coffee absently. "I've been seeing a therapist trying to understand why I avoid confrontation so much, why I couldn't just tell you directly that I needed some space instead of complaining behind your back. It's helping." I felt a complicated mix of emotions at his revelations. Part of me was relieved that he wasn't moving across the country, that he had reconsidered his relationship with Stephanie. But I was also wary of falling back into old patterns. "I'm proud of you for doing that work," I said sincerely. "It takes courage to look at yourself honestly." "I learned that from you," he said with a small smile. "You always taught me to face difficult truths." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words between us gradually lightening. "So where do we go from here?" Daniel finally asked. "Forward but differently," I said. "I need to continue building my own life with interests and relationships beyond you, and you need to communicate honestly with me instead of avoiding conflict. And our relationship? We'll rebuild it, but with healthier boundaries for both of us. Maybe monthly dinners instead of weekly. Phone calls when we actually have something to share, not out of obligation. You respecting my new interests, and me respecting your need for independence." He nodded, looking both relieved and a little sad. "That sounds right. I miss you, Mom. I miss our relationship, but I think this new version might be better for both of us." "I think so too," I agreed. "What about Stephanie?" he asked hesitantly. "Will you be able to forgive her?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm not ready for that yet," I admitted. "What she said was deeply hurtful, and unlike you, she hasn't reached out to apologize. But I won't stand in the way of your relationship. If you choose to marry her, I'll respect that. I just need more time before we try to rebuild any kind of relationship between us." "I understand," Daniel said. "She knows she handled things badly too. We're working on it." As we finished our drinks, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. I showed him photos of my watercolor paintings on my phone, and he told me about a new client at work. The interaction felt different, more like two adults sharing parts of their separate lives, rather than the enmeshed relationship we had developed. When it was time to leave, Daniel stood and tentatively opened his arms. I stepped into his embrace, feeling the familiar comfort of hugging my child, but also a new respect between us. We had both been changed by this painful experience, and while the hurt wasn't completely healed, the foundation for something healthier had been laid. "I love you, Mom," he whispered against my hair. "I love you too," I replied, stepping back to look at him. "Always." As I walked home afterward, taking the scenic route through the park, I reflected on everything that had happened. The pain that had seemed unbearable just weeks ago had transformed into an opportunity for necessary growth. I had learned to love my son without depending on him for my sense of self. I had rediscovered parts of my identity that had nothing to do with being a mother or a widow. The strongest relationships, I realized, are not those of dependence, but those where each person is whole and complete on their own, choosing to share parts of their journey rather than merging paths entirely. Daniel and I would never go back to what we had before, but perhaps what we were building now was actually stronger, more authentic, and ultimately more loving. Reaching the top of the hill in the park, I paused to look out over the city. Portland spread before me familiar, and yet somehow new, filled with possibilities I was only beginning to explore. At 65, I was discovering that life could still surprise me, that I could still grow and change and find new purpose. The painful awakening in Daniel's car had ultimately led me to a kind of freedom I hadn't known I needed. Have you ever discovered that something painful ultimately led to necessary growth in your life? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this journey of rediscovering yourself after heartbreak resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Remember that it's never too late to find new parts of yourself, to build healthy boundaries, or to redefine relationships on better terms. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I wish you all the courage to face your own difficult truths with compassion for yourself and others.